Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be tackling a topic that I think a lot of you have been really curious about, and that's this whole idea of how ancestry and biology and racial identity all kind of like work together and sometimes don't.
Yeah, it can definitely feel like a puzzle where the pieces don't quite fit right. You look in the mirror, you think about your family history, and then there's the whole concept of race that we're all trying to make sense of.
Exactly. And it's like how much is actually about our genes and how much is stuff that we've like socially constructed over time.
That's the million-dollar question. And to be honest, it's a question that a lot of people are grappling with right now. There's a huge surge in interest in things like transracialism and what that even means. So we're going to be trying to untangle some of that today.
I love it. So to help us with this puzzle, we've got like a whole smorgasbord of sources. We've got YouTube videos. Some of them are like super thought-provoking. Some of them are just wild. We've got Reddit threads where people are sharing their very personal stories, a thesis from a trans Japanese woman, and even some Wikipedia and scientific studies just to kind of ground us.
It's fascinating to see how many different angles people are coming at this from, and I think it speaks to how much this stuff is on people's minds.
Okay, so let's bring in the science then. What does science actually have to say about all of this? Like, do our genes actually determine our race?
Okay, so the Human Genome Project was kind of a game changer for this whole conversation. It showed that the genetic differences between what we traditionally call racial groups are actually much smaller than the variations within those groups.
Wait, so you're saying like two people who both identify as white could be more different genetically than a white person and someone who identifies as a different race?
Exactly. Genetically speaking, humans are a lot more alike than we tend to think. And that tiny percentage of difference is what we've built these really complex social structures around.
Wow, that's crazy. So how does that tiny percentage actually play out in those physical differences that we see, like skin color, hair texture, those things that we often use to categorize people?
So those visible traits are influenced by a small subset of genes, but the vast majority of our DNA doesn't really play a role in those features.
So we might see someone and immediately categorize them based on race, but those categories don't actually reflect the vast genetic similarity that we all share.
It's a huge disconnect, and it fuels a lot of the debate around transracialism, which some sources define as basically identifying with a race different from the one that you were assigned at birth.
And this is where someone like Rachel Dolezal comes in, right? She was all over the news a few years back for presenting herself as black, even though her parents are white.
Yeah, her story really ignited a lot of controversy. Some people defended her right to self-identify, while others saw it as a form of cultural appropriation.
It definitely raises questions about how much of race is about personal feeling and how much is about ancestry and lived experience.
There are definitely some parallels to the transgender experience, but there are also some key differences that make this whole conversation even more complex.
So where do we go from here? How do we even start to reconcile these seemingly conflicting ideas about race and identity?
Well, I think the first step is just acknowledging the complexity of it all. We need to move beyond those really simplistic arguments for or against transracialism and really try to understand the nuances of all these different perspectives.
I love that. So as we dive deeper into all these fascinating sources, I want to encourage everyone listening to think about what resonates with them the most. What questions are popping up for you? This is the journey we're taking together, and your insights are super valuable.
It's really hard to forget that story of the young black girl in Europe that we talked about from the Reddit community. She talked about how facing all that intense racism actually led her to want to transition to white.
Yeah, it was such a powerful story and really heartbreaking. It makes you think about how much pain she must have been going through to feel like she needed to escape her own racial identity.
And her experience wasn't unique. In another post from that same community, someone shared their story of being the only black person on a bus and feeling like all eyes were on them, all these stereotypes and judgments.
It's a reminder that for some people, this desire to transition racially isn't just about some kind of cultural affinity. It's about seeking refuge from very real pain and discrimination.
Absolutely. And in her case, it was even more complicated because she was facing this internal conflict within her own family. They even went to therapy to try and address the unhappiness that stemmed from their racial identity.
It's hard to imagine what that must have been like.
It really highlights how those external forces, those societal pressures, can have this huge impact on how we see ourselves and where we feel like we belong. And in her case, it even led her to reject her own culture. She started setting these rules for herself, like avoiding any discussions about race or anything that would reinforce her black identity.
Wow, It's just so sad. It's like she felt like she had to erase a part of herself just to feel accepted.
It speaks to the power of racism and how it can make people feel like their only option is to distance themselves from their own race. But it's important to remember that not all transracial experiences come from that kind of trauma.
Right. We also have stories of people who feel this deep and genuine connection to a culture that's different from their own, like that trans Japanese woman and her thesis.
Yes, her story is so fascinating because it represents a different side of transracialism. She talks about this deep yearning for cultural immersion, this longing to be seen and treated as a member of the race that she identifies with.
And she didn't grow up immersed in that desired culture,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So that must have made things even more complex.
Definitely. She talks about the challenges of navigating that disconnect between her physical appearance and her internal sense of belonging. But what I find really interesting is that she doesn't shy away from acknowledging the complexities of transracialism.
So she's aware of the potential for it to be problematic.
She is. She acknowledges that people might perceive it as focusing on the superficial aspects of a culture, like being into K-pop or having certain beauty standards. She even addresses the critique that it can be seen as just playing dress up.
Yeah, that's a pretty common argument against transracialism, the idea that it's not a genuine cultural connection, it's more about aesthetics.
Exactly. But she pushes back against that by saying that for many transracial individuals, it's this deep desire to connect with a culture on a much deeper level. It's not just about superficial things.
She even did some polling in the transracial community, didn't she? What did she find?
She did. And it was really interesting. She found that a lot of the people she polled prioritized cultural elements over physical appearance. So it suggests that there's this genuine desire for immersion, not just a change in appearance.
It's a reminder that there's a whole spectrum of experiences within the transracial community. We can't just lump everyone together.
Right. And of course, not everyone views these aspirations positively. There are also voices that challenge the whole idea of transracialism.
Like in the RCTA Safe Forum, where we saw that Chinese individual pushing back pretty hard against the concept.
Yeah, they made the argument that you can't truly understand the struggles and the richness of a culture without having lived those experiences firsthand.
Which raises some big questions about what it actually means to belong to a culture. Can you really adopt a racial identity if you haven't experienced the historical and social realities that are tied to that race?
That's the core of their argument. They challenged people who wanted to transition to Chinese by pointing out all those things that people often overlook, like the traditional food and the family expectations. It's a reminder that culture goes so much deeper than just the things that look cool or trendy.
They also talked about feeling frustrated, like their culture was being reduced to something superficial and desirable, while the real struggles and complexities were being ignored.
And that frustration makes sense. It speaks to this worry that transracialism can sometimes trivialize the experiences of marginalized groups.
And we saw this play out in the whole Rachel Dolezal situation, too. There was a huge backlash against her for presenting herself as black, even though she had white parents.
It became this flashpoint for conversations about white privilege and cultural appropriation. Some people saw her actions as a form of blackface perpetuating harmful stereotypes, while others defended her right to self-identify.
It's a really emotionally charged topic, and it's clear that there's no easy answer.
Definitely. And I think the biggest takeaway here is that transracialism is complex. There are so many different experiences and perspectives involved. And to really understand it, you need empathy, open-mindedness, and a willingness to listen to all sides.
It seems like respectful communication is absolutely key to having these conversations.
Absolutely. Even when we're talking about these really sensitive and sometimes controversial issues, we can still find common ground through empathy and understanding.
It all comes back to recognizing that behind every perspective is a human being with their own unique experiences and beliefs.
Exactly. We need to keep learning, keep questioning, and keep our minds open.
So we've talked about the personal stories, the history and all that, but what about the future? Like with all this technology that's popping up, could we actually get to a point where the concept of race just becomes obsolete?
It's a wild thought, right? Like the genome editing Wikipedia page talks about how we're getting closer and closer to being able to actually alter our physical traits, the very things we've used to define race for so long.
So imagine a future where you could literally choose your physical features. Would you do it?
Yeah.
What would that even mean for society?
It really makes you think, would those traditional categories of race even hold up anymore if we could just change things like our skin tone or our hair texture through gene editing?
It's like hitting the reset button on centuries of judging people based on how they look. But I wonder, would we really be able to escape that urge? to categorize people? Like, would new divisions just pop up?
You know, the History of Nations and Racism video on YouTube made a really interesting point about how humans have always found ways to define themselves in relation to others, whether it's through tribes, religion, nationality, you name it.
So even if we took away those physical markers of race, we'd probably just find new ways to draw lines between us.
It's definitely possible. But maybe this whole tech thing could actually be a good thing.
How so?
Well, what if it forces us to finally confront the reality that race is a social construct, not some biological fact? Like maybe these advancements could help us get rid of those old categories and embrace a more fluid and inclusive way of understanding human diversity.
It's a nice thought. But even if we got to that point, we'd still have to deal with the legacy of racial inequality that's baked into our systems, right?
Oh, absolutely. The legal and political implications are huge. We'd have to rethink things like affirmative action, which were created to address those historical disparities based on race.
Would those policies even be necessary anymore if race became less relevant? Or would we need new ones to address new forms of inequality that might pop up?
That's a really important question, and one that would need a ton of discussion and careful consideration.
Right.
And it's not just about policy either. Think about cultural identity, like what happens to things like Black History Month, or the concept of cultural appropriation in a world where the lines of race are super blurry.
It's a lot to wrap our heads around, and it shows how important it is to talk about the consequences of these technological advancements. We can't just get caught up in the wow factor without thinking about the social and ethical side of things.
Exactly. We need to be actively shaping the future we want, not just waiting to see what happens and then reacting.
And it's clear from all these sources that respectful communication is key when we're having these conversations, especially when they touch on such sensitive topics.
100%. The RCTA Safe Forum is a good example of that. Even when people had really strong opinions, they were still able to have productive conversations by listening to each other and trying to understand where the other person was coming from.
It all comes back to recognizing that behind every opinion and every story is a human being with their own unique experiences and beliefs.
And that journey of understanding both ourselves and others is never really over.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into ancestry biology and racial identity, what's the one thing you really hope our listeners take away from all this?
I think the biggest thing is to embrace the complexity. There are no easy answers when it comes to race and identity. But if we're willing to have those tough conversations, listen with empathy, and stay open to new ideas, we can navigate this whole thing together.
I love that. It's been awesome exploring this topic with you, and to everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to keep exploring these important questions.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep growing.